Welcome to part 2 of this video series. This video aims to help instructors adapt to ChatGPT in their classrooms, and part 2 will focus on a framework that's intended to help you think in the long term or in the bigger picture about how you might want to start making changes to your classrooms. This framework, I should acknowledge, is a first draft. It's my own thinking about how I want to approach this task of updating and revising my own assignments in my classroom. And it's really focused on classroom settings. So thinking about the ways that we ask students to use language as a way to develop their content knowledge in whatever courses they're in. And this framework just has two principles. The first is that adaptation should be made in response to your purposes as an instructor for asking students to use language in your classes. And the second principle is that your adaptations should be made in relationship to your expectations for and your belief about students' independent use of language. And I want to trouble that notion of independence a little bit. But first, if we look at principle 1, what are the reasons why we ask students to use language? I can think of 6 or 7 of those. I think that language-based activities in the classroom can serve as a way for students to practice and refine their contextual use of language. And here, I think that this is just, we often ask students to use language because we take for granted that it's a skill of value for their future careers. And so sort of in some ways, it's the idea that we ask them to practice because if they don't use it, they'll lose it. A second major way is that we ask students to use language-based activities as a way for communal or shared knowledge, right? So knowledge that exists already out in the world to become internalized by the learner. And this is often referred to by writing across the curriculum folks as writing to learn activities. So here, written language serves as a learning tool. A related use of language is oral communication that is used as a way to co-construct and clarify knowledge through discussion. And so here, the act of talking with one another then serves as a way for students to learn to understand material that they're engaging with, right? But again, it's sort of the use of language as a learning tool. Third, we ask students to use language in classrooms as a way for them to externalize their internalized knowledge. So what is it that they know inside? How can they use language on a test, say, so we can check whether they actually know it, right? So in this case, language is being used primarily as a medium to prove knowledge of a student. Fourth, we might ask students to use language as a way for them to engage in reflection and self-awareness. I think of this purpose as identity construction and personal growth, so sort of that meta-awareness of where they're at with their learning, but also how they feel about that, how they relate to that. Fifth is the use of language to tell stories. So this is very common in creative writing classes, for example, where language is being used as an artistic medium. And then finally on this list, actually I think quite a rare use of language in classroom settings, but totally common outside of classrooms, is as a way to communicate with real clients, customers, or colleagues, right? So I think that it's actually quite rare that we're asking students to use language for applied problem solving. And what that means is that really these other purposes are more common or more likely to be the driving reasons why we're asking students to use language in classroom settings. So, why then does ChatGPT feel like a threat to us? I think it's because if we look at these possible ways that we're asking students to use language in the classroom, at present, I think that we have a pretty high existing value or expectation that students are using what we think of as their own words, so that they're not, sort of copying and pasting something else. We usually discourage them from plagiarizing outright. If they're citing, we want them to do that in ways that are very visible. And so underlying most of our ways of thinking about language in classroom settings is the expectation or the belief that students should be using their own words as a way to move themselves forward in their learning or their understanding. And of course, here I've said that, that value is high across the board, and that's not necessarily true. There are cases where some teachers, may have very different ways of using language as a tool for learning that maybe does allow students to start with an existing essay and revise it, for example. But I think overall, we often sort of have the assumption that students are using their own words or starting with their own words as they're working through these different ways of using language in the classroom. What I want to do is challenge the idea that students are ever using language independently, right? So this notion of their own words is actually problematic. And we can see that if we ask questions like this. Are students' own words really their own? Do you think that Standard American Edited English is anyone's first language, right? If you don't think that people are born speaking Standard American Edited English, then in some ways you're acknowledging that way of writing and speaking is in fact something that is not their own to start with. It's something that they maybe have internalized, but it's not necessarily their own language. Do you expect students to already know key disciplinary language when they come into your class? If you don't, then what you're acknowledging is that you're trying to stretch their own language into new terminology that is of value to your discipline or profession. Do you expect students to couch their thinking or analysis or methods in relationship to existing scholarship? If you do, what you're acknowledging is that you want them to put their own words in conversation with other people's own words. And so even there's an expectation, or there's sort of an acknowledgement that students can't entirely rely on their own words as academics necessarily. Do you allow students or encourage students to make use of the Writing Center or peer review when they're producing or revising written work? If you do, then you're acknowledging that there are times when allowing students to modify their own words in relationship to guidance from someone else is appropriate. Again, this idea of their own words then sort of falls apart a little bit. Do you allow students to make use of database search engines to locate research? If you do, what you will know from your own searches probably is that the more able you are to use the language of librarians and data managers, the better the search results are, right? And so in some ways, even that search task is one where they have to use somebody else's words in order to generate material for their own writing. Do you allow or encourage or require students to use templates? Again, if yes, then in some ways you're telling them that you want them to reframe their own words in somebody else's format, right? So again, there's sort of there's a relationship between what is their own and what is being handed to them. And then these last two are more about the use of technology. Do you allow students to copy and paste quotes from other works? If they're attributing that effectively. If so, then you're again sort of acknowledging that even that literal Control-C, Control-V task is taking someone else's words and just pasting it in without filtering it necessarily through the student. And finally, do you allow students to use a keyboard, spell check, APA, MLA, other style manuals? Again, all of those are ways that their own words are being mediated by technologies. Here I'm considering a style manual in some ways a type of technology. And so the takeaway then for me here is, in ways big and small, students' language is always located in relationship to others and technologies. So I would say then that the idea that students are ever using entirely their own words is actually just a fiction. It's a really compelling fiction. It's one that I find myself sort of defaulting to all the time. So I certainly share this way of thinking, but I have to remind myself that in some ways it is a fiction. That's partially because all language builds on previous language. That's true even in the case of new scientific discovery or market invention. Those discoveries and inventions still have to be made relevant to the larger community through language that is accessible to them. Also, we're in the business of altering students' language resources and through that process their conceptual knowledge frameworks. So what we're doing as we teach them is trying to expand their language. So again, this notion that their own language, that they have to be able to produce it on their own, that's tricky because we're thinking about change over time and the potential notion that they're internalizing new language as their own. And then finally, I would just mention that there's a gap. This is true for all language users between what we consider receptive vocabulary, so what a person might understand as they read, and what they might produce in their own writing. So there's a gap between what they know for many learners and what they can express in language, right? So it's not necessarily the case that they don't know it always, but they may not be able to yet express it in language. They may not have it as part of their productive vocabulary. So one possibility for ChatGPT is that we might rethink the way that we consider students and student performance. So what if we start thinking more explicitly about student performance as something like individual aided by machine? Or if we think of student performance as the sum total of all knowledge and language to which they have been exposed and to which they have access in the moment. What if that's a way to understand what a student knows? And clearly what this does is it shakes up the idea that a student must entirely sort of internalize language and knowledge. That's very problematic, and I think that there are big reasons why we might want to resist that. But I do think that ChatGPT encourages us to ask questions like that. And I think if we can ask questions like that, it allows us then to come back to this previous chart that I shared and to think about places where we might be willing to challenge or modify our expectations for students to use their own language for these different kinds of language uses in the classroom. It also allows us then to ask, when do we really want to restrict students to what we think of as their own words? So their fully internalized knowledge and understanding. And one case that I can think of is maybe high stakes exams, where written responses are the only way that we can test what they know individually. So in those cases where it's really important that they must have that individual knowledge set in their own mind without access to other technology. Maybe high-stakes exams are one of the places where maybe we've got to move back towards pen and paper tests in timed settings. On the other hand, though, now we can start thinking about places where we can learn to coexist with and even leverage ChatGPT. One of the places where I'm thinking about this is usually when I ask students to write, I assume that they're generating their own text initially, but I actually think that there are now opportunities where they might just hand over the initial task generation task to ChatGPT. One thing that ChatGPT is able to do very well is produce 1,000 words in no time at all. And so the initial generation step can be much shortened, and ideally then that allows me to spend much more time on some of the nuances of specific expectations for communication in specific settings. So that's one of the examples. You can see some other examples here that I suggest. So what is the best case? For me, I think right now, this may change, but right now I think that we learned to start thinking about ChatGPT as a collaborator. I find that is the term that comes to mind as I interact with ChatGPT, and I like that one because it allows me to see, just like all of the human collaborators that I work with, that it has many powerful strengths, but it also has limitations. It's a resource, but it's not necessarily an authority, or I have to start learning the way that I can trust it as an authority, and the ways where I have to acknowledge that it's just a resource that I can consider. So that idea of ChatGPT as collaborator, at least for me, is where I think that I'm moving and thinking about how I want to integrate it in the classroom. And then as a second takeaway possibly is that maybe we need to recognize a need to revise our assumptions about and our assessments for what students must be able to do, know, and write on their own, right? So that idea of independence of knowledge, I think that we're going to have to start challenging that in big ways. And here, when I mentioned that our assessments might also need to be revised, what I mean by that is most of the way that education, K-12 and higher ed, is currently set up is with the expectation that learners are sort of independent actors in the world, and that we must be able to hold them individually accountable. And I wonder if we're moving towards a place where we can start to challenge that way of thinking. I hope this video has been helpful. If you have questions or ideas, I'm very happy to hear from you. I'm leaving you with my email address here at the end. Thanks.